my brother and I firm resolve deployment of anti-missile systems is in South Korea's best interests. Our sole contention is restoring deterrence. The deployment of anti-missile systems deters North Korean aggression for two reasons. The first is by legitimizing the Red Line. Sick of the Hill 2000 in 2014 explains that the U.S. is losing credibility abroad to intervene because Assad crossed our red line in Syria, Putin in Ukraine, and we did nothing. Deploying missile defense reaffirms U.S. commitment to South Korea. Yaramone of the U.S. Army explains that despite nuclear and missile threats from North Korea, the U.S.-South Korea alliance will continue to grow stronger. The U.S. will continue its ironclad commitment to the defense of the peninsula, emphasizing the deployment of missile defense. Strong commitment to South Korea is vital in deterring North Korea as it exemplifies the U.S.'s resolve in defending South Korea in the case of conflict. Auslan of the Atlantic in 2017 argues that only a firm U.S. promise to defend the South will deter North Korea. Scaling back the alliance would hand Kim a major strategic victory, removing the single greatest deterrent to aggression. North Korea would be emboldened to continue trying to provoke South Korea, leading to future crises. Second, deterring North Korean aggression. North Korea poses a legitimate threat to the U.S. London of CNN reports in 2017 that North Korea tested an intercontinental ballistic missile that appears to have the range to hit major U.S. cities. Due to this, the U.S. nuclear umbrella is broken. Park of Kookmin University explains that South Korea depends on the U.S. promise of a nuclear umbrella to deter a North Korean nuclear attack. Now, it would not be easy for the U.S. to retaliate against a North Korean nuclear attack on South Korea because the retaliation could provoke a nuclear attack on the U.S. Thus, Hill of the University of Denver explains this June that North Korea's appetite for nuclear weapons is rooted in aggression. North Korea seeks to decouple the U.S. from South Korea, a split that would set the stage for an invasion of its own. Hill reasons that if North Korea had long-range nuclear weapons, it might be able to change the strategic calculus by threatening to launch a nuclear attack in response to intervention on the peninsula. Bush of the Brookings Institute reports this August that the single greatest danger North Korea's nuclear program poses is that North Korea may soon assume that it can now act more recklessly against South Korea at the conventional level because it can counter the U.S. at a nuclear level. North Korea escalates the conflict by sinking a South Korean naval vessel, bombarding South Korean-controlled islands in the West Sea, or creating trouble in the demilitarized zone. Once North Korea can target the continental U.S., it will likely take bigger risks than it has to date. Thus, Rovier of Real Clear Defense concludes in 2017 that if North Korea develops an ICBM, there will be a series of unacceptable consequences, namely increased North Korean provocation and a far more catastrophic future war. South Korean missile defense provides defense against North Korean threats to the U.S. So the Asia Pacific Journal in 2017 explains that the anti-missile systems deployed in South Korea hold significance in strategic context. If North Korea succeeds in developing an ICBM, anti-missile systems within South Korea can detect a launch and relate its trajectory to the U.S. missile defense so that we can successfully shoot the missile down. It also protects the South Korean mainland. The Economist finds in 2017 that a layered South Korean missile defense would destroy 90% of incoming land-based missiles. Anti-missile systems prevent North Korea from taking aggressive actions against South Korea. Caraco, the Strategic Studies Quarterly, explains in 2017 that missile defense raises the threshold for aggression because they create uncertainty about the effect of an escalatory threat or attack and thereby help thwart adversary escalation strategies. Overall, deterrence is key to preventing conflict, as Beauchamp of Vox in 2017 explains. North Korea has been hyper-repressive for its entire existence, yet it has not launched an attack against the South. This is because if we can annihilate North Korea, then they are never going to attack anyone. We have set 64 years of evidence that deterrence works, so we are proud to affirm.
We're going to run some prep time starting now. $320 remaining. Judges ready? Opponents ready? Anika ready? Awesome.
Let's begin. We negate, resolve, deployment of anti-missile systems is in South Korea's best interest. We offer one observation. King 17 of the University of Southern California reports that Kim Jong-un's top priority is the survival of his regime and himself. As such, he will not actually attack another country unless he is provoked first, since he would be risking full retaliation from the United States and its allies. Contention 1 is a preemptive strike. Right now, the United States is beginning to favor a preemptive attack on North Korea due to North Korea's development of missiles that can finally hit the continental U.S. Indeed, Levy 17 of U.S. News finds that half of America now favors military actions against North Korea, an approach also flavored heavily by current U.S. President Donald Trump. Gerke 17 of the Washington Examiner continues that even some Democratic congressmen are joining with their conservative counterparts to shift their support towards a first strike against North Korea. However, Gomez 17 of the National Interest writes that the U.S. has never risked an attack due to fear of retaliation on crucial U.S. forces within South Korea. Indeed, Cho 17 of the Korea Expose explains that the primary reason the United States is deploying THAAD is to protect U.S. troops in the event of a North Korean strike on South Korea, even though THAAD will do virtually nothing to protect South Koreans. Unfortunately, a 2016 report by the Union of Concerned Scientists then explains that by causing U.S. political and military leaders to overestimate the capability of defense, new anti-missile systems create a false sense of security in U.S. policy that can lead to disastrous consequences. In this context, Gomez explains that the perceived greater protection the anti-missile system provides to U.S. troops reduces the fear of northern retaliation to the point where a U.S. first strike becomes far more likely. But don't just take the word of a reputable military analyst for it. Mindock 17 of The Independent finds that after the start of THAAD deployment in March of this year, the U.S. military accelerated training for missions simulating first strike scenarios on North Korea. And while debatably advantageous for the United States, a U.S. preemptive strike against North Korea is most certainly not in South Korea's best interest. Bowden 17 of The Atlantic writes that beyond missiles and nuclear warheads, North Korea possesses many dangerous weapons, chemical, biological, and conventional, that are fully capable of killing millions of South Koreans, anti-missile system deployed or not. And Rich 17 of the New York Times finds that in the event of an American attack, Kim Jong-un would have no way of knowing whether he would be safe personally, forcing him to use all of the weapons at his disposal and killing millions of innocent South Koreans. Contention 2 is North Korean bravado. North Korea has survived for 60 years by making itself seem so strong that other countries can't antagonize it. As such, making them feel vulnerable by deploying an anti-missile system causes them to be more aggressive in two ways. First, a rise in small attacks. Grunow 4 of Princeton University finds that empirically, North Korea has responded to conditions of heightened vulnerability by becoming more provocative and more aggressive, as if to show that they aren't afraid or cowed in the slightest. Park 15 of Pepperdine University elaborates on how this increased aggression manifests, finding that North Korea has launched 120 smaller attacks on South Korea to date, largely in response to U.S. aggression, ranging from shelling military bases to sinking submarines. Second, stopping negotiations. As part of this need to appear strong, North Korea actually refuses to negotiate more when in a position of weakness than a position of strength. Grunow explains that in the early 2000s, North Korea reacted to perceived U.S. aggression by backing out of the six-party talks, preventing negotiations from succeeding out of fear that they'd appear weak. Problematically, negotiations reduce tensions in the region. Grunow concludes that the sole reason tensions haven't already escalated to war over smaller disputes is because sporadic negotiations between the two countries have helped level heads prevail. Even more tangibly, Bandow 16 of the World Post finds that North Korea is better behaved empirically when involved in negotiations. Every single war throughout history has started with a preemptive strike. North Korea is not going to be the one to launch that strike. Let's make sure we don't either. Thanks.
And I see, sorry, 1 second.
Yep.
U.S. has simulated first strike scenarios in that. And the second piece of evidence you read in your small text.
Park of Pepperdine.
This is the first one highlighted.
Do you have the second one also there?
It's beneath.
What?
Judges.
Trophies.
Oh.
The judges.
Do disclose, don't confer.
Wait, stop, right? Where's the other part?
Yeah, it's right underneath.
There's evidence that says it's because of U.S. aggression.
Let's go down. Probably not to.
That was 44. Okay. Pretty close, right?
Yeah. I was ready for your rebuttal.
First question, if we're ready. If the U.S. strikes preemptively, what will China do?
Probably nothing.
They
Maybe
said
it'll respond
they
on the
s-
peninsula.
They said that they back North Korea. This is because they signed an agreement, a military contract, basically saying that they back North Korea in case of
So
conflict.
I have a couple of problems with that.
Yes.
One is that China's been growing pretty dissatisfied with North Korea in recent years. North Korea did that
But-
thing where Kim Jong-un killed a bunch of his relatives.
couple
that
of
they didn't
weeks.
like. They also have been lashing out and not obeying China
But-
when China told them to
But-
denuclearize. So
a
I'd
couple
argue that
of
they're
weeks
not
ago, they came out and said that if the U.S. struck first, that they would back North Korea. Would the U.S.
Here's-
would they ever risk the cost of a conflict with China?
Yes, because in
They
the
would
past,
risk the
what we've
cost
done-
of a conflict with
Can I
China.
explain?
Yes.
Awesome. So the most likely response China would have is maybe it supports North Korea in the peninsula. That would make sense. But the U.S. has shown a willingness to engage in that kind of proxy war in the past in order to get what we want.
So we
what
want-
China's not going to do is attack the continental U.S.
So-
and that's an
No,
option.
no,
we're okay
wait.
with.
So we're
We wanna
gonna
protect
engage in a
ourselves.
proxy war now with China. Does the U.S. want that?
I'd say it's probably not our favorite outcome, but you and I both agree that the U.S. is really, really scared about this ICBM in the hands of someone we perceive to be unstable. At that point, we prefer to have a proxy war on the Korean Peninsula
Wait.
to take out the ICBM
Doesn't missile
than to have
defense solve that? Doesn't missile
No.
defense get rid of that fear so we no longer need
Here's-
to preemptively strike?
here's
We
the-
feel like we can actually take other options such as diplomacy,
So-
such as peaceful
Yeah, so
resolution,
Harrison-
because we can stop the ICBM.
Here's the problem with that. First off, you tell me that missile defense isn't entirely effective. It only stops 90%
Well,
of
that's
missiles.
for
I'd
South
say
Korea,
that the
but
United
then-
States would still rather not be hit with 10% of missiles.
But-
second,
But the Kurako evidence, which is also really important, explains that the reason why North Korea would never launch one is because the risk that it can be shot down
Yeah.
means that the U.S. can retaliate,
But
and North
Harrison-
Korea won't take that risk.
Harrison.
So if there's not a 100% certainty that it will land, it will never strike.
At that point, I'd just say that we have missile defense systems in the U.S. right now. There's never going to be a 100% probability that North Korea is going to be able to hit us. But I'd argue that even more importantly than that is that North Korea is continuing to develop its nuclear program, and you never give me a reason why it would actually stop that. At that point, the U.S. has an incentive to resolve this nuclear development of
How do you
North Korea.
resolve this nuclear development?
We don't resolve it, but we're telling you that at least we don't have an attack that catalyzes
Wait, no.
the consequences.
If both sides don't resolve it, then doesn't that mean both sides, on both sides, they still have the incentive to preemptively strike?
No.
Wait,
Well,
but that's
we're arguing that they do have an incentive to preemptively strike, but they're not going to actually carry it out.
only when
because
they
their
feel
troops are still at risk.
insecure, right? And they only feel insecure when they have nothing to defend themselves with.
No, we tell you that the reason they preemptively strike is because now they feel secure, but they know that in the near future that might not be
But
the
your
case, so
warrant
they
for a
want to solve
preemptive
this.
strike is because they feel insecure, right? And then you're saying missile defense makes them feel secure.
No,
So why would
the
they
ICBM
preemptively
makes
strike?
them feel secure in the short term. We're still really not happy when other countries have the capability to hurt us. Look at what happened in Iraq. We didn't want them getting nuclear weapons, even though there was no chance that they would be able to hit us.
They didn't have it. We'll take that.
start off with my opponent's observation. They tell you that Kim Jong-un wants survival, so he's only going to attack when he's provoked. Recognize that escalation is going to be the best link into provoking North Korea. Let's compare it to their impacts, and their first one talks about preemptive strikes. But the only way that we would consider a preemptive strike is if there's escalation in the region, and both sides feel like the other one is going to attack first, and there are more tensions. So if we win escalation, then we automatically win this argument. But they go to their second, impact, where they talk about negotiations. Negotiations literally cannot happen if the two countries are fighting conventionally. That's really important because if the tensions are that high, then negotiations never manifest and they can't get an impact. Therefore, we preclude any impacts they get. Let's go to their first contention on preemptive strikes. 4 responses, and the first comes from Newsweek, which explains that China has come out and said that in the case of a United States preemptive strike on North Korea, they would back North Korea. The warrant is really simple. They don't want the United States coming into North Korea, taking over the country, and then literally being on the border of China. Therefore, they have strategic interest in maintaining North Korean stability and maintaining the regime there. That's why if the United States strikes first, they would back them. That's really important because it's not a proxy war, as my opponents say. It's literally China going into North Korea and the United States going into North Korea and fighting each other. 2 major allies don't want to do that. The United States isn't dumb, and they're never going to do a preemptive strike. But the second response comes from The Guardian, which explains that the exercises that my opponents are talking about and the positioning of military troops aren't happening right now because they explain that there are literally no plans to do a preemptive strike because the United States government isn't that dumb. Just because Trump has come out and publicly stated that all options are on the table doesn't mean that all options are actually on the table. In fact, I would argue that he's being pushed more towards domestic policy than foreign policy, and Mattis is taking over, which normally doesn't sound like a good thing, but in this case, he's more against the preemptive strike. But then the third argument is a turn, because Caraco explains that historically when you have missile defense systems in place, it increases crisis stability because it gives the government a way out. He explains that in the days prior to North Korea's 2006 Taepyeong 2 launch, some former senior officials recommended a preemptive U.S. strike against the North Korean missile site. The existence of a limited U.S. homeland defense capability, however, provided President Bush with an alternative to preemptively striking North Korea's launch facilities. We are giving you competing warrants, but at least we show you that history is on our side. But the fourth response is on their impact specifically. They give you this rich evidence which says that like a North Korean preemptive strike would be devastating, right? All those things. If Rich can tell you that a preemptive strike would be devastating, then I'm sure the government knows that a preemptive strike would be devastating. At that point, there's literally no probability that the United States would do this. We would say that it's more probable in their world, though. Let's go to their second contention on North Korean escalation. Their first warrant is that you provoke North Korea. 2 responses. The first is that their Genau evidence, which is their link, says that the reason they are provoked and the reason they would escalate is because of a preemptive strikes. Therefore, if they lose the preemptive strike contention, then they lose this argument. But secondly, in a world without missile defense systems, they would take a lot bigger risks. So even though they say they make 100 small-scale provocations, that doesn't necessarily mean anything if they're not escalating further. We say the only thing that prevents them from escalating further is the fact that the United States can annihilate them. But if they have ICBMs, that prevents the United States from taking that course of action unless we have missile defense systems. Go to their second warrant where they talk about a decrease in negotiations. 2 responses. The first comes from Austin, who explains that 25 years of negotiations have failed. And the warrant is provided by Jackson, who explains that negotiations will never work because North Korea does not want to denuclearize. In fact, they would rather eat grass than give up their nuclear weapons. But then the second response is that you can turn the argument, because even if you do bring Kim Jong-un to the table, that's really bad, because he creates an incentive for the United States to make concessions by dangling peace. And that's really important because Kim explains that they dangle the hope for peace in return for aid, and Van Dow explains they use that aid to funnel into their military apparatus, which only exponentially increases their threat. Thus, I urge you to affirm.
We're going to run some pep time, starting now.
214 and 213.
Okay. Is everybody ready? I'm going to start off with the top of 3 case. First contention, only contention talks about North Korean aggression. The first way they try to access this is through this red line argument, and they essentially tell you that the United States is going to look as though that they're not protecting South Korea, and thus North Korea is going to retaliate. We have 3 responses. First of all, unless the alliance is actually heard between South Korea and the United States, North Korea is not going to receive it to be heard. That's because North Korea is not on the outside of all this foreign policy. For example, in the past, the United States has condemned South Korea for their feeble stance on North Korea so many times. At that point, unless the alliance is actually heard, this impact will manifest. And the alliance isn't hurt for 2 reasons. First of all, Sang Pun of the Sejong Institute finds that the alliance is so much stronger than they make it out to be because what's happening is small policy disputes just as bad have made the alliance a lot stronger, and thus they're really not that volatile. But second of all, it's just a phase because Snyder tells you that the calls have always been made that seem like the alliance is on the collapse, but the alliance has never actually been on the collapse. At that point, it's really not probable. But third of all, even if you believe that that the United States and South Korean alliance is going to be perceptually weaker, they're going to make sure that North Korea doesn't get this perception. Because what Delaney explains is that the United States is trying to preserve their alliance with South Korea so that they don't provoke North Korea. At that point, if you want to believe that, the United States is just going to find other ways to fill the gap of not deploying that and make sure that North Korea knows that South Korea and the United States still stand strong together. Then let's go on to their second war. They talk about deterring North Korea. First of all, this is predicated on the fact that North Korea is going to attack first. We have a couple of reasons why that's literally never going to happen. First of all, because China will protect them. January 17 of the Washington Post explains that while China may defend North Korea against a U.S. assault, it has refused to help North Korea if the country strikes first. That's really critical because North Korea has literally no international support. It's not going to attack first. But second of all, because South Korea has them outgunned. Stilwell 17 of the Business Insider finds that South Korea spends 5 times as much on their defense as North Korea and could easily repel a northern assault. At that point, North Korea has really little incentive to attack. But third of all, a first strike means an obliteration as long as the alliance stands. The United States has stated on many occasions that were the North to attack first, the full military capacity of the United States would be deployed against them. At that point, it's really, really unlikely that North Korea is going to attack first. The only scenario in which war is actually probable is if you go for us for the Gomez evidence in our first contention that tells you that once the United States troops are secured with that, the United States feels a lot safer attacking launching this preemptive strike on North Korea because they feel that their troops are safe. At that point, that's really bad for South Korea's best interest because the United States is not going to be able to defend South Korea from all these artillery attacks. That being said, let's look at the warrants. That being said, let's look at the warrants, right? On their world, you may have a war, but you have a war with an anti-missile system. In our world, you don't have a war. I prefer a world without a war than a war with an anti-missile system where 10% of missiles still may get through. But let's talk about this layered defense argument anyways. First of all, they tell you that layered defense is really good because it protects against 90% of missiles. First of all, Elman of the ISS writes that even all the layered defense systems in South Korea are not enough to protect against North Korean missiles. That's really critical because in their world, you're still not intercepting the majority of missiles. But second of all, it doesn't matter because North Korea is more likely to attack with artillery if they know that that is in place. And what Pasterix of the Huffington Post tells you is that artillery strikes are not intercepted by missile defense systems, and thus North Korea still has a really, really easy target on the United States. But at the end of the day, the way mechanism is really clear. A world with a war is a lot worse than a world without a war. That being said, let's move on to their responses to our case. To our first contention, they give you a couple of responses. First of all, they tell you that they give you the evidence from Newsweek that says that China would back North Korea would back North Korea in the case of U.S. attack. Recognize the United States would definitely be willing to take this risk because they even tell you that North Korea has an ICBM missile that can hit the United States. Maybe in the past the United States would not have taken this risk, but at the point where United States lives are at risk in California, in Alaska, in Hawaii, it's changed the decision-making calculus. But second of all, they give you this Guardian evidence that tells you that Trump isn't moving towards this policy. But the Mindog evidence that we read you at the bottom of our case is very explicit, telling you that in March the United States started preparing for a preemptive strike. If you look at the timeline, as soon as that was halted, this preemptive strike for preparation was halted as well. It's really critical. But fourth, they give you this Caraco evidence that that's fine.
During Crossfire.
Yeah.
During Crossfire, can I see whatever evidence that says that was halted, so preemptive strikes were halted?
Or just the timeline.
Okay. That's the time.
It's the Mindog rating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just look at that during Crossfire?
I'd like to have my computer.
Okay.
Sorry.
Take that. Can you point to me where it says these practices were ever halted.
I don't think it says that.
Okay.
It's just-
We have 208 left.
Okay. Is everyone ready? You tell me in your bubble that the United States is willing to take the risk of a preemptive strike because North Korea's ICBMs have been threatening. If they can defend themselves from those ICBMs, will they be willing to take the risk?
Yes, here's the reason why. Because the United States doesn't want to lose any lives, right? So at the point where the ICBM still has the probability of hitting the United States, they want to take out the ICBM.
Wait, if they know that that will definitely lead to a retaliation, right? If they do nothing, right, there's less probability that North Korea is going to attack the United States with that ICBM, right?
Well, the United States doesn't want to take that risk. Like, I agree that North Korea probably won't attack. The
Okay,
problem is,
yeah.
that's not how the U.S. foreign policy decision-making calculus works. For example, in Iraq, the United States was willing to go in and invade with nuclear weapons, even though Iraq never even said that they were going to attack the United States, or they didn't even have proof that they had nuclear weapons.
Do you have a question?
Yeah. So, in response to my first contention, you tell me that if the the government knows that a strike won't work, then the United States won't do it, right?
Yeah.
Is the United States, is the reason the United States deploying that to protect South Korea or the United States?
It does both.
No, but what's the primary objective of deploying the system?
It helps protect the U.S. bases and people in South Korea, and it helps protect the U.S. mainland.
Well, see, the
Does
problem,
both.
yeah, well, the show evidence in our case is the primary purpose of this anti-missile system is to protect U.S. troops in South Korea. At that point, if the troops are protected, no U.S. lives are going to be hurt.
Wait.
Thus, they're going to feel more emboldened to strike, right?
Wait. Okay, so, like, let's just clarify this. Because
Yeah.
we're talking about, like, if the in one instance you said that if the United States knows that they're 100% safe, then they'll launch a preemptive strike. But then, like, 30 seconds ago, you were just saying that if they know that they can risk some lives by North
No.
Korea striking the United States,
No.
then they'll
You're
launch a preemptive
you're
strike. So does it happen because of security or insecurity?
You're misconstruing my arguments. Here's the distinction. When North Korea has the ability to hit U.S. homeland with an ICBM, that's when they get really nervous and they want to attack. But the reason they don't do it is because they're afraid that North Korea is going to retaliate against the U.S. troops in South
I
Korea.
mean, if the United States has to say that, like, 20,000 of our troops in South Korea are dead because of a North Korean strike, I'm pretty sure that's something that they would also be very insecure about. Like,
Yeah,
this
we
is,
agree.
right?
Obviously, they don't want their troops to die. That's why they
Yeah.
want that.
Yeah, okay, so.
But that's
again,
exactly
like,
the argument.
Basically, can I ask you another question?
Go for it.
So you tell me that North Korea would never, or the United States would never attack first, right? Or North Korea would never
Yeah.
attack first, right? You're saying that, like, in the case of an escalatory cycle, North Korea would attack, right?
No, but we're saying if the U.S. preempts them, they have no option to attack.
Like,
Obviously, if you get bombed,
Yeah.
you're not just going to sit there completely.
But, like, if both sides are building up, right, is there a perception for North Korea that war is on that, war is, like, on the brink that they would strike?
No, that's not true. Perception is different from an actual strike.
I thought it was 7-11. Just ready. The third first voting issue is diplomacy. What we tell you is that if you vote for the negative, when you vote for diplomacy, North Korea dangles the hopes for peace, the hopes for denuclearization in order to get aid to bolster their military. Insofar as they never respond to that, that's a clear way to vote for us, because if you vote for the negative, you're making them more of a threat. But the second way you vote for us is on preemptive strikes. My opponents say that we're preparing right now. However, in August, which post-dates their evidence, the United States Navy officials said that despite Mr. Trump's heightened rhetoric, the Navy has not repositioned any ships in the Korean Peninsula, nor were there any ships to do so, which would preclude an American strike. This is because America knows that if we strike first, then that means a war with China. That is the best, most likely path into U.S. lives being lost, and that's why we're never going to engage in that preemptive strike. But even if you buy that a preemptive strike is possible, they never respond to the Krakow term, which explains that U.S. insecurity is what leads to a preemptive strike. That's why missile defense is key to preventing a preemptive strike. In the past, when North Korea tested nuclear missiles, the reason why we didn't actually preemptively strike North Korea was because we had missile defense. We knew that we can engage in diplomacy, we can engage in peaceful resolutions to the conflict because we weren't scared. However, when you don't have missile defense, you create that insecurity that makes the U.S. that makes the U.S. feel threatened and strike first. But you vote for us on deterring North Korean aggression. My opponents say that no war is the best war. However, 64 years of deterrence has worked in preventing a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. If we prove that deterrence will only work if you have missile defense, then that is the clearest way to vote for us. My opponents say that North Korea will never strike first. We're not talking about a North Korean nuclear strike first. We're talking about small-scale escalations, such as using artillery shells. The reason why they would do this is because when they have an ICBM and they can threaten the U.S. will have to make a hard decision. Are they going to trade Washington for Seoul? And the answer is no. However, when you have missile defense, what Seo explains is that it enables the U.S. to stop any ICBM. That means the U.S. has nuclear deterrence against North Korea. North Korea will never engage in the escalation that will lead to conflict. Remember, escalation is the best path to conflict because it leads to miscalculation and brinksmanship. Both sides feel like conflict will be inevitable, and that's when we have war.
Oh, actually, can I see a card about stopping preparations for a preemptive strike?
Is that not happening?
Can you find me these ones?
It was August
11.
Running prep. Judges ready? Opponents? Partner? Awesome. Defense time. Starting this turn, they put on negotiations. They essentially tell you that North Korea is going to get concessions and use it to bolster its military. Keep in mind, it does not matter how strong the North Korean military is if they're not using it. At that point, if we can prove to you that we stop a war, it does not matter if North Korea gets more guns. But second, on this point of the alliance that they keep bringing up, there are two really important responses they never respond to, which mean you don't give them this impact. They dropped it. First is Snyder, who tells you that the alliance is never going to collapse, even though there are all these people creating fake news about how the alliance is getting weaker. It's not actually going to happen, and North Korea knows it. But second is Delaney, who tells you that the purpose of the U.S.-South Korean alliance is to deter North Korean aggression, which is why they just fill in the gap in other ways if this was causing problems. Now, the biggest and most important voting issue in today's round is going to be on this idea of North Korea. We give you 3 reasons why North Korea is never going to attack, and they don't respond to any of them. They just tell you that they can still use artillery. Artillery is still an act of war. North Korea is not going to attack because 1, China isn't going to defend it if it attacks first, according to Denner. 2, South Korea has it far outgunned, which is why they're not going to be able to risk a war. And 3, as long as the alliance is strong, they're not going to risk retaliation from the United States or any other allies. At that point, North Korea is not going to attack unless someone else attacks first. That proves that escalation isn't a prereq to war. Instead, a U.S. preemptive strike is the only way that war is going to happen in today's round. So let's talk about those preemptive strikes. They tell you it's not going to happen for 3 reasons. 1, because China would retaliate. 2, because there would be consequences towards South Korea. And 3, they place this term that says the U.S. is more likely to negotiate. I have one response to that. The ICBM has changed things, because now for the first time in American history, we are terrified that North Korea has the capability to hit us. That's why we're willing to risk this proxy war, we're willing to risk the consequences on South Korea, and we're not going to negotiate because we're worried North Korea is going to keep developing. But what Gomez tells you is the one thing holding us back right now is our troops in South Korea, but THAAD alleviates that, which is why Gomez tells us we're finally willing to risk a preemptive strike. Mindock tells you after THAAD was deployed, we started accelerating programs, and their own card tells you that when THAAD was temporarily halted, that's when we stopped those programs. But at the end of the day, Bandau tells you that no matter how good it is for the US or how bad for the US, it's going to be really bad for South Korea because THAAD isn't capable of protecting them from artillery, and 10% of missiles still get through. At that point, in their world, 10% of missiles are still hitting them, and they're still getting rained on with bullets in Seoul, but in our world, there's no conflict.
Before Carl, can you tell me where our ethics system?
So dates are obvious.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ready, crosstalk.
Here's the first question.
So, if it's not a so like, if the U.S. and China engage in a conflict where both sides are fighting each other, China is killing U.S. soldiers, we're killing Chinese soldiers, doesn't that risk a conflict with the U.S. and China?
Yes. If China and the U.S. are fighting, that risks a conflict with China.
Does the U.S. want that?
I mean,
No, but I'd argue that we're more worried that a nuclear bomb is going to fall on Los Angeles.
Wait. You yourself.
Okay, so like, let's just look at this. This saw evidence, right, which says that THAAD protects the United States using early radar detection. Does that not solve back for that insecurity of
No, for
launching
2
ICBMs?
reasons. One is because you tell me in your own case that missile defense isn't 100% effective.
No, that's on
and
South Korea.
Even SAW doesn't say,
US.
guys, even SAW doesn't say that you can protect the United States 100% of the time. But 2 is I'd argue that we are still really worried that North Korea is going to continue developing, which is why we have an incentive
Were
to take
you
out
the one who
just
read?
like,
and 3, I'd say that we're still worried that North Korea has the capability to hit us, whether or not we have missile defense programs, because we don't like countries
What was
having
your first response under the why they won't attack?
Because China won't defend them.
So you just provided your own warrant as to why we need to have missile defense.
No,
There's no
here's the
like the
difference.
U.S. wouldn't
Here's the
feel
difference.
insecure.
North Korea has literally no international support, right? Their only ally is China. If China doesn't back them, they're done.
Okay,
So then
how does
why does the U.S. feel so scared?
Because North Korea has an ICBM, and we don't like the idea
So let's
that
say
Kim Jong-un has a missile that can hit
In a
California.
war between North Korea and the United States, we take forward, obviously, like we have the upper hand. But we don't want the ICBM launcher the first
So
time.
your argument is that
let's just-
insecurity creates the preemptive strike.
No, we're saying that
that's-
having
that's-
security
okay.
and insecurity together creates the
But
preemptive.
it doesn't make any sense. Like,
Yes, it does.
okay.
We're telling you guys.
So then
How
doesn't
can you
that
have-
mean it's not
if you
unique?
have
You guys
security,
are oversimplifying this a lot, right?
Okay.
Because it's insecurity in the sense that there is the potential for this missile to hit the United States. But it's security in the sense
that we feel comfortable attacking, protecting our troops
I
in
just
South
don't
Korea.
understand.
Wait,
I
no,
just
but you have to
don't
look at
understand how
your
that's
argument is that
possible.
what creates why we need to feel secure is because we feel insecure.
I'm arguing that the insecurity that we're creating and the security are not comparable. We're just using the security as a band-aid so that we
No,
can
but
attack
Which
them.
one is it going to be in your final focus? Security or insecurity?
That's not, that's
Wait,
not
wait.
simplification.
No.
It's not
Your
how it
argument.
works.
Your argument
That's not
is
how
that the
US
reason
policy
why
works.
we need to feel more secure, the reason why we need to feel more
In the
secure
short
mainland
term.
and for troops is because we feel insecure. So if we never feel insecure,
The fact that
there's
the
no
words
need.
both have that the words both have the word secure in them doesn't mean that they're like equivalent facts. We're saying that we need to feel secure about our troops so that we're willing to launch this preemptive strike that we think will alleviate this bigger insecurity of being hit by a nuclear bomb.
I'm
That's
just
not
saying
the
the logic applies to both scenarios. So if you just,
Take the rest of the crap.
Okay. Is everyone ready? Right. Let's start off on the first major voting issue, which is preemptive strikes. And I totally say that we do preemptive strike because we're scared of an ICBM. We saw evidence that review explains that that protects the United States from an ICBM because they use early radar detection. That's really important because without missile defense, we're basically going in blind to a nuclear strike. Therefore, we would be much more insecure and much more likely to launch a nuclear strike than we talk about. The second way they say it is that when we feel too safe about our troops, then we are going to launch a preemptive strike. The two are inherently contradictory because they're using logic that is like, in one sense, that we're going to launch a preemptive strike because we feel insecure, so we can take out their nukes if they want to attack us, but then when we feel too secure, we'll also launch a preemptive strike because we know there will be no retaliation. These are inherently contradictory, so at the end of the day, you have to make them pick one, but we would argue that history is on our side. When we're more insecure, that's when we try to do preemptive strike, and that's the Caraco evidence, which they cold drop in the round, which is that in 2006, we considered a preemptive strike because at the end of the day, we considered it, but we didn't do it because at the end of the day, we had an infantile missile defense systems that we knew would protect us. But let's go to the real major, and that's why right now, the Guardian evidence that we read says that we aren't planning for a preemptive strike. If their argument was true, then we would be doing it in the status quo. But let's go to where you're really voting for us, which is off of escalation. They never respond to the way my brother does in summary, which is really important. It's that escalation is important. Is the strongest link into conflict for two reasons. The first is that it increases the chance of miscalculation, which means that either the United States might strike first or that North Korea might strike first. At that point, there are three responses about why North Korea wouldn't strike first don't apply. But secondly, it leads to a brinksmanship mentality where both sides feel like they are on the brink of war and think they need to strike first to avoid the most amount of damages. But here's really where you're voting for us, because they never actually touch the links. Bush explains that when North Korea has an ICBM, they feel like they can blackmail the United States and escalate and be more reckless in the region. That's really important because Beauchamp explains that escalation is the most probable link into conflict. The way that we solve for this is by having missile defense systems, because if you can protect the United States mainland, then the United States can say, we're not scared of you, North Korea, you can't blackmail us, we will annihilate you if you do anything, and at that point, our nuclear deterrence is restored and we can prevent any form of escalation. Therefore, I urge you.
We're going to run the rest of the question.
First, on their point of escalation in North Korea, they tell you that escalation is really important, but throughout summary and final focus, they never respond to the fact that escalation doesn't happen if North Korea doesn't attack. And North Korea doesn't attack for three reasons. First of all, because of Daniel, who tells you that China won't back them. Second of all, because of the South Korea has such bigger military capacities. And third, because the United States alliance with South Korea is so strong. At that point, first, even if you want to believe that escalation links into decreasing preemptive strikes, it doesn't matter if North Korea doesn't attack. There is no conflict escalation. But the really clear way to vote for us is going to be on our point on preemptive strikes. Their only response that can extend through final focus is that when they have more defense, they're less likely to go on the offense. But recognize this is contingent on the fact that the decision-making calculus hasn't changed, but it has, because the ICBM that has been developed can now hit North Korea. It's not linear. It's not either you want to go it's not either you feel secure or insecure. It's the fact that when a missile can hit the United States wants to assure that that doesn't happen. So but the only way to make sure that U.S. lives are lost in the process is by having that, according to Gomez, and protecting against a preemptive strike. But they say to look to history, right? We are going to give you a much more recent historical example that accounts for the ICBM change in mentality, and that's the Mindock evidence that tells you that the United States started gearing up for a preemptive strike in March, which was when THAAD was deployed. But their own evidence from August tells you that when THAAD was halted, what happens after THAAD was halted, the United States stopped gearing up for a preemptive strike, and that's going to be really critical, because what happens at the end of our case, according to the Patrick evidence, is that the United States North Korea can still retaliate against South Korea in the event of an artillery strike, which is really critical, because that means that even with an anti-missile system intercepting 90% of the missiles, 10% of the missiles gets through, and artillery still hurts South Korean civilians. So let's do the comparison. In their world, you have a war, but you have a war with an anti-missile system where 10% of missiles get through. But in our world, you don't have a war and no missiles get through. And the United States always works in their own best interest, and thus that is going to protect their troops and not South Korea.